Our final item we want to talk about today is domain and range. So when we're talking about graphing, it's important to know what we can put in for the values and then also the values that we're going to get out of these functions. So the domain is what goes into your function. And you can almost think of this like in computer programming language. What am I putting into my program, right? These are going to correspond to our x values. So what can I possibly put in for my x-axis? So if you're looking at the graph, you may want to look at the x-axis to see what are the possible values. The range is your output. What are you getting out of that function, of that program? What's coming out of it? That's going to be the possible values, right? Your range or your y value. So this time you look at your y-axis and see what are the possible values. Are there any restrictions? So here is just a picture. So if you had a graph, you would just look at your x-axis to see what are the domains, what are they ranging, right? What's your x? And then your range, you would look at your y's and say, are there any limitations on my y? So let's go through a couple examples. So on this first one, y equals 8x minus 5. All I did was graph it on using GeoGebra, their input function. And when I graph it, I'll notice that it's a linear equation. It's just a straight line. I could also look at the function and notice it's a linear equation because there aren't any exponents on those variables. Dead giveaway. So this one, we want to look at the x's first. Is there any restriction for what I can put in for x? Well, if I look here, I can put anything I want in for x, any real number. So x, the domain, is actually just all real numbers. You can put any real number you want in for x, and then you can solve it and it will give you a y value. There's no restriction. Now let's look at the range, which is the outputs. Okay, y. Or I could look here at the y-axis up and down. Notice that it's a straight line and it keeps on going either direction forever. That means there's no restriction for the range either. So we would say all real numbers. In fact, we could actually solve for x and figure out what values I could put in for y. So a good rule of thumb thing to know is for linear equations, just like we graphed here, the domain and range are always going to be all real numbers. There's no restriction on them. Okay, that's true for any linear equation because it goes both directions either way. Well, except if you're a flat line, horizontal line or a vertical line, because those are a little bit different. But generally speaking, any other type of linear equation, it will have all real numbers, and the range will also be all real numbers because there's no restrictions going on. Now let's talk about a quadratic. Now again, I just plugged this into GeoGebra. It gave me this wonderful handy dandy graph. And I want to start with the domain. Domain is your x values. Notice it's kind of like shaped like this. So it's actually going out either direction. So it's going to be heading out to infinity either direction for your x values. So there's no actual restriction. I can put whatever I want in for x. Okay, put whatever I want in for x and I can solve this, square it, subtract 5, and I'll get my y value. So the domain is all real numbers. Again, yay, nothing too exciting so far. But the range is a little bit different. I want you to look at the range. I want you to look at those y values. We look at the y values here. Are there any restrictions? Can I get to -6? Does -6 trace to anything on the graph? No, it doesn't, right? What's the smallest value I can reach? It looks like -5, right? Looks like the smallest y value I can get to, the bottom of the barrel here, is -5. So the range for quadratics is actually going to be an inequality. Because if we look here, the minimum is -5. So that means my y values have to be larger. They have to be greater than. Since it's heading in an upward direction, they'd have to be greater than or equal to that -5. We can't get anything smaller than -5. We can get -6, -7, so on and so forth. So our range is that inequality. And that's going to be true for any quadratic. Any quadratic equation, you're going to have a domain where you can pick any real number, yay! But then your range is restricted because it's either going to be facing up, so you have a minimum value there, or it's going to be facing down, so it could be facing down, in which you would have a maximum y value, and then it would have to be all the values less than that. So just be careful to graph this and then look to see which direction is my quadratic heading. Okay, is it up or is it down? And that will restrict my range. So that's all we're going to talk about for the domain and range. There is more to talk about later on in the section, especially if you get to radicals or anything like that. But a good rule of thumb is just to graph it, see if there's any restrictions, and then move on from there. So give it some time, try it out, let me know what you think.